And now we're live. Okay, so SUSE QE Tools workshop is running. Hi and welcome everybody. Today we would like to talk about triggering openQA tests, pull requests, or the bigger context being using openQA in integration with other CI systems. For that, we already in the past worked on some features, have recently added related features as well as integration and test system. And also we have some plans for the future. So Marius, you could go or talk about what we currently have. Show examples, the GitHub integration. Then later on I can follow up with what else is there and the plans are for the near future.
Yes, I can share my screen.
Yep.
One moment. And maybe let's
Good.
start with having a look at the documentation, because things are documented. That's unfortunately not the right section here. Let me look a little bit further. That's just
It
the
is
section about,
related.
yeah, it's kind of related. I was just looking for GitHub here. Because that's definitely occurring in the right section. Yeah, and here we are running openQA jobs SCI checks. And that is something you could read. Of course, I'm going to show you other things, but maybe two takeaways here. So we have one one approach, which is to create and monitor openQA jobs from within the CI runner. That is also what I'm going to show you. That is using openQA CLI with the schedule subcommand and the monitor flag. And that basically means you need some runner on, for instance, GitHub, but it could actually be anything that's willing to execute your code, where you can execute openQA CLI. And it will basically use the API to schedule a set of jobs. And then it will also use the API to monitor the status of these jobs, to basically block the runner until the remote openQA instance says everything has run. And that's it. So you basically use a runner, but you're not running anything there for real. That's still running on the remote openQA instance, and you only use the runner for monitoring. That's the architecture. And you can use the scenario definitions to specify examples like this. That's an example in our very simplified example distribution. But that's more for how the jobs are scheduled. Also, of course, important. But yeah, you could actually use that also independently of CI. That's also why it's actually explained also in the user guide, if you want to know more about this way of scheduling a set of jobs. Here, the main takeaway is we use this preferably for CI, because it means we don't rely on any variables in the test distribution, in the openQA instance. So you don't need to specify a test suite, machine, whatever. In the openQA instance, your CI jobs can run independently of that.
Yeah, that could mean that one could spawn an openQA instance from scratch, in, for example, in a cloud instance, because all the relevant information is in the Git repository.
Yeah. Then we have a second approach, which is completely different, and you could use that as an alternative. I'm not going into details of how it works here because, as you can see, it has two lengthy subsections. Just the main idea, and that is you use a webhook, and all of yeah, and that basically means GitHub will tell um, openQA via a special API we have added in openQA that something has happened, like a pull request has been created, and then openQA is reacting to that on its own by creating a certain set of jobs, and then it will run the jobs, and it keeps track of the initial API request, and after all jobs have been done, it knows, okay, um, that was due to that API request. Let's now report back the status. And there and that is actually a neat approach in theory, because it means um, you don't need to have a runner like a GitHub action just for spawning and monitoring jobs. It's a bit more efficient because GitHub just says, okay, there was a pull request, then openQA does all what's necessary on its own and just reports back the status. And that's also a bit nicer, more nicely integrated. You will see these checks showing up as specific openQA jobs, as specific openQA checks. And while the jobs are running, there can of course be more than just one. It also gives you a status like 3 or 4 jobs have finished. Yeah, so in theory, that's actually nicer than what I've shown you before, but it also has limitations. So you can only spawn jobs in a limited way. Of course, you can use the scenario definitions I've mentioned, but in practice, you maybe want more. That's actually just the same link we've followed before. But in practice, you want more. So maybe I show you what we do in practice now. And that's the first approach, and why the second approach wouldn't work with that. Um, so I think it was that
openQA
YAML
YAML.
file.
Yeah.
Um, so here we basically do what I've said before. We invoke openQA CLI schedule. However, before we do that, we also have a step before, and that is figuring out the latest published Tumbleweed build. And that is required because we use that build in order to schedule our new job. Like you can see here, one variable here, for instance, uses that build here in the middle. And of course, that's something custom which needs to run somewhere here in that GitHub runner, and that's nothing you can so far provide using that approach. So only that neat little detail of figuring out the latest tumbleweed build and then making up variables on the fly for that means we cannot use that actually nicer approach and fall back to the first approach. So I suppose in general you would prefer the first approach then, because it gives you that flexibility when it comes to scheduling jobs, even though it's not so neatly integrated with GitHub.
Yeah, I would say by now it certainly should be possible also to use the more integrated approach by triggering by not determining the QCow image on openQA with the latest build, but instead go to a static link to an appliance. So basically a juice image of Tumbleweed from download
Mhm.
openSUSE.org. Because we could, yeah, exactly there where you are with the cursor in line 39, we could say
Yeah,
HTTP one under URL equals download openSUSE.org and then open minimal VM dot UCOW2, and then it would
right.
download that 200 megabyte Q.
If you don't need any special variables and all of that is basically static, then it would work. Yeah, you could, if you were interested in the second approach and also want a real life example for that, I think we had something in
You can
our
just go
example.
to any pull request of author-instance.
I just wanted to show an example for the second
Oh,
approach.
yeah, right.
Um, okay, that's actually the first approach once more. That's openqa.yaml. Um, maybe it was that. No. Okay, I think we removed it. Or no, of course not. It's not a workflow actually, because like I said,
Yeah,
it has this neat integration. It's not actually visible there. I think you need to configure that
it's just
somewhere
in the
in the settings.
settings. Yeah.
Yeah, under webhooks, most likely it will now tell me, no, it won't. Yeah, so that's a webhook being set up there. Yeah, now I needed to enter the danger zone, which I won't. Um, and it's all explained there, here, where you need to click and so on. And yeah. Okay, but now let's go into the first approach again, because I think that's the most flexible one. And if you want to see how it looks like, we definitely just need to go into one pull request. Here it says 9 checks. And yeah, that's the one. Run a basic openQA test. Now we can go on details.
What's
And
interesting to see already on the overview page that running the actual OpenQA test in OpenQA is quicker than doing the static analysis of the code, which takes 1 minute longer.
yes,
So
nothing is
you
really
never need
very,
to wait longer for that.
yes, it won't slow you down. Of course, it's not a good measure because these static tests are very slow actually for what we are doing. Um, yeah, here you see the line we saw before, um, right? That
Which just determines
first
the
check.
build in the first step so that we know what the latest template.
Yeah, and then it does that command line with openqa CLI schedule.
Could you scroll in
And
here, zoom in?
I know, yeah. And you can, yeah, see it has only created one job. It could have been more, for instance, also jobs that relate to each other using dependencies. And of course, you can just follow the link and see what was done. That's a very simple test. It only selects the first entry in the boot menu and waits until it gets a prompt. But that's actually already testing a lot. Yeah, because the basic setup is apparently still working. Um, you can see here that it has actually a scheduled product. So it was using ISUS post, and that is the call that was done. And that is also the concrete scenario definitions YAML. That's what I mentioned before and what the documentation was getting at when pointing you to the scenario definitions here and also here in the other approach. Um, so yeah, and that's also here the same variable. And you could extend that to schedule actually multiple jobs at once. And we designed it like this because most likely that's wanted at some point in practice. Um, yeah, and here you can also see the monitoring at work. So it's scheduled, then running, then done. Yeah, so not really much more to say here. It's not so complicated. And possibly what's maybe complicated is the way um, variables are handled, but if you just follow our examples, you should be fine. Um, and that is one important point here. We use not on pull request because, yeah, as it says here, that would be problematic for credentials, I think, and we use on pull request target instead. But again, if you follow our examples, you would just do the right thing when setting things up. So yeah, and you could read the documentation in detail if you want to know.
Yeah, I would say that the main caveat of that is that it actually would only matter if you're actually changing the workflow definition itself in
Mhm.
test target.
Yes. Yeah, I've mentioned it because it's one of the things we um, had to look into because initially it wasn't so clear to us what's best to use. I'm wondering, maybe that's too old, but I think it's not. Yeah, I just wanted to show in our openQA distribution, we actually do the same, but unfortunately, um, we only have old stuff still being open. Which doesn't mean we don't have anything at all. Actually, we have that for a while, but logs are gone. Okay, so not very
Yeah,
interesting.
what you can see, it took 13 minutes there to execute those tests because the actual scenario definitions that we use there, actually what we do is in every pull request, we run nearly the same test that we also run after, which is like the full set of tests.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to show it, because it's an example where having these scenario definitions as opposed to just making a single post for one job makes actually sense, because here we have multiple jobs. And if you already know openQA's scheduling tables, you will be familiar with products, machines, and job templates. It's basically all the same, just in one file. Of course, you could also use that, not for CI purposes, but for scheduling anything and not having to care about what's configured in terms of settings in the instance. Um, Yeah, so that is basically what we have so far. Yeah, do you want to continue, Oliver, with the next topic we likely want to go into now?
Yes, sure. I can switch over to sharing my screen, and then I can show you a little bit of the next steps that we have planned. I'd like to give a little bit of the broader context. So all what Marius has presented is done under, I'll call it our top level foundational task, which is Saga. That's full version control awareness within openQA, fully version test schedules, and configurations. The goal there is that everything is in simple cases, everything concerning openQA tests is in a Git repository. And as we have seen for the openQA in openQA test distribution, that's already the case, right? So if you set up a new openQA instance and you would run openQA and openQA tests on that instance, you don't need to configure anything in that instance of openQA. You only need the permissions to schedule tests there, and then everything comes from the Git repository. We have the test modules in the test distribution. We have the test plan, the Git distribution with the scenario definitions, and we have everything we need for adding new changes there. Like if somebody creates a pull request, then we trigger recording tests in that openQA instance. We feed back the result in that openQA instance, and we know exactly what we trigger. That also helps to show the exact version of tests that a job had been running. And you can also see that if you trigger those tests from Git, then also the source code links from the test details page when you see the modules and you follow that link, you can see how that points to the corresponding test code. So let me show once more how that looks like in openQA. So why do we do that in this repository? Well, we have the example distribution. The example distribution would stay a really small and easily understandable example. This distribution is a bit more complicated, but it of course is not that big as also audience distribution SUSE. And so we use that as the tools team working on that saga to make sure that this repository is in shape and can show the concept. So as I stated, we have a scenario definition here, which are all the scenarios. You can see all those scenarios mentioned here, and those are the ones you can also find then on recording test details page. So you can see those 6 scenarios coming again up here with the same name. And then what we can also see, so let me taking one example here, and I'm navigating to the same details that Marius showed. We are following this multiple links, and then just let's pick any of the jobs, doesn't matter. And then we know exactly from where this was triggered. So we know that this was from this fork from SQL12, this branch MM, and in the vars JSON and files we have the git hash. And if we would follow that source window, then you can see that we're actually ending up in that source code window on that fork in that very git hash. Okay, so openQA knows that this is coming from, and it can link that. Now, what I'm saying that this part is done and this part is finished. What is missing? There are certainly some things for some ideas for improvement coming up whenever we work on that. So, for example, with the recent situation, there was some feedback and some issues we encountered where we could improve. Let's see where we find those. Very recent idea, for example, here, find last build of a product over API. You have seen that workflow definition that Marius showed about finding the latest build of the latest published Tumbleweed, which is a common recurring thing, find a last build of a product. So what we figured is that it should be helpful to provide that over a stable API. So we are currently working on that so that something like this code would be, well, more simple so that we don't need this longer line of JQ trickery, but instead we are using a stable API of it. So it's not directly related to providing version control awareness, but it's motivated by the bigger context and similar stories to that. Then there's also the idea for longer, for example, so let's say you open a pull request in also we open SUSE, and you have this one single openQA test triggered. And it's a crucial path for it still boots, but in most cases, when you are doing changes, you're changing like some leaf module. Let's say you're changing the Firefox test module. The Firefox test module wasn't even triggered as part of that. So, and what you guys commonly do as contributors to the test distribution provide verification runs. For that, for years, we already have this tooling with a command line tool, openQA clone custom git rep spec, where you can say, hey, openQA, take this job and clone it, but run it against my pull. And that with the CI integration can now be combined so that we can not need to rely on command line interface, but that we can just using the GitHub web UI, we could tell over a GitHub comment or the GitHub description. So this ticket is about the GitHub description that when you open a pull request, you could say, hey, openQA, additional to the happy path that you're triggering with the boot snapshot, also clone this scenario, but maybe put it into the same test build. And then also provides the corresponding feedback so that on GitHub, the reviewers can easily see a green check mark or a red cross if that verification runs. Similar to that, it should be possible then to trigger that in comments. So that role would be different. So for example, not the reviewee opening the pull request, putting it in the description, but here the reviewer could say like, hey, openQA, please test this pull request also against this scenario because it might break this one. And related to that, it would be nice to support test parameterization so that you could say, hey, openQA, please also run this verification run, but set this variable or set that variable or exclude those modules from this. That's actually part of an epic within the Saga. Use openQA clone custom git rep spec, or another means something like that to parse GitHub description plus comments and be able to parameterize. What else is included in that Saga? What else is included that we want to have? So basically, the goal of a full openQA test development able in a browser without the need of a local terminal. So, think of more mobile work environments, or where actually people already use the browser as really a common platform for a lot of things. And yes, it's already possible to, spawn up GitHub code spaces, and already years ago I showed examples with Gitpod where you can run openQA, you can build openQA, you can change openQA tests, and you can also trigger openQA tests from that integrated session, but it's not fully accessible for everybody, so it's a bit, it still needs a bit of experimentation and trying around. So the goal for that story here, to make it more streamlined, really accessible, and available with a click of a button from the OpenQA documentation, or maybe even from the OpenQA web UI. They click a button, then it points you corresponding for your corresponding fork or the corresponding code fork, and then on GitHub you could apply the changes, and then with the aforementioned CI integration, any changes that you commit over the web interface would automatically trigger openQA tests. And then you can parameterize those tests just with writing a comment on GitHub. Then you don't need the command line interface at all. Obviously, we want to keep the command line interface because, I mean, for myself, I can say that this is one of the most efficient environments to use local terminal and Vim and like a bash prompt, but that it's becoming more and more common and also more efficient idea. There are other ideas which are not mentioned in specific tickets, but could be more fleshed out, mentioned here. There are also other things that come to mind in the saga. Sorry, I had that open there. To let's see what there. Yeah, the needle handling and part of the strings, smarter fetch needles. Yeah. GitHub template repositories for wheels and everything around wheels. So the idea there is to make big distributions like OS Audience more scalable by also, again, using Git repositories with certain plugins, but so that you have separate projects, and then you can make sure that you have corresponding quality goals for those projects and not have everything in one big repo. And one other part about the scenario definitions is that what we showed is possible in back to A. So again, explained, we have wheels. So let me show you one example here. So the example being wheels, and in OS Audience we're already using one wheel, which is OS Audience Launcher, to launch applications over the graphical environment. That one is checked out over Git. And then we have the scenario definitions, which include the complete test schedule definition, meaning that I can show you bugs. Right? If we take a look in the job group here, you can see that the job templates are actually empty. Everything is coming from that one Git repository, and that concept could, of course, be used and extended by other test distributions now. So, for example, you guys can go ahead and implement that in OS Audience History OpenSUSE. We already have the scenario definition file there, and I would say it's up to you to extend that concept so that if that's the goal you would like to follow, then you can put all test schedule definitions in YAML files within that distribution. Of course, it could also come from other distributions and then integrate it with Git submodules or wheels. Regarding cloning from Git or wheels, what we lately worked on, let's looking for just cache. That's not mentioned there. Now, help me find the corresponding tip about the cache.
I'll have a look.
But it should actually show up here, but maybe I have lost the link and it's only indirectly referenced. Anyway, I can, yeah. What we already elaborated in a Spike solution, use local caching of Git repository. And we have stories now planned to fix it for wheels, because we already have, as I showed you, we already have wheels since about 2 years now in OS Audience Distri openQA. But within OS Audience Distri OpenSUSE, we saw that sometimes there are problems to read that from GitHub, and actually it would trigger 1000 tests, and all the 1000 tests would rerun from GitHub. Yeah, that's actually part of the saga. Maybe I was looking on the wrong level. Right. So cache distribution. Right. It was under a different saga. Fine. If you take a look on the on the saga level, then so if you're looking for cache, then we can see we have multiple things planned there. The goal is so that OS Audience Distri OpenSUSE can then again use wheels as well as reading the test itself from Git more efficiently without needing to reclone all the time from GitHub. We're currently, let's say, still experimenting with that. The main feature is there, but before we tell everybody to use it, we want to stabilize it. Now, it's up to you. You're welcome now to ask any question or ideas or wishes around this area. What do you think? Okay. No ideas there? Any questions on chat? Then let me invite you to the next workshop session next week, which is again the first Friday of a month. And there we would like to just discuss the roadmap as of 2024 February. The last one was cut a bit short, so also I think it doesn't make sense to upload the recording. So I'm sure that we can have a much more. If we still have some minutes, so if you want to hang around in the room or ask some more questions or have some ideas after stop the recording, you're welcome to do so. But until then, I'm done now. So